Hello, welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in 1 Kings chapter 5. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please come if you can. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also be meeting at 9 a.m. for classes, so please join us for those if you can as well. You're welcome to join us in the auditorium to watch this class on the large screen there. We have these English Standard Version Bibles available from the World Bible School. If you'd care to have one, please contact our church office and we'll make arrangements to get you one. We have many on the sick list, so please refer to our bulletin for more information. As is our custom, we want to remember the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined by a third man on the way. When they got to their destination, that third man revealed himself to be Jesus, the Christ, risen from the dead, and left their company. When he was gone, the two men reflected on their time with him and realized that there had been a burning in their hearts while he'd been with them. It's that burning that they had in their hearts that we hope to kindle in our own hearts as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of his word. We also want to remember the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy for the Lord our God is holy. And we want to remember the admonitions and encouragements we learned from the stories of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. But the most important takeaway from the stories, I believe, is the story of the prophet that came to Jeroboam while Jeroboam was doing something that was against God's will. Once he'd visited with Jeroboam and told him what God had sent him to tell, he started on his way home and was met in the way by a prophet from Israel who wanted the honor of his company and promptly told the first prophet that the Lord had sent him, which was a lie. And the man believed the lie and went and had a meal with this prophet from Israel. And the Lord demanded his life because of this, because he disobeyed the instruction explicitly that the Lord had given him. And it's important for us to realize that there are people in this world who will present themselves as messengers of God, who will bring you messages that don't sound awful. They sound pleasant. They sound wonderful. But they're wrong. They're absolutely against the will of God. And often explicitly so. They're explicitly against something that the Lord has stated plainly. And it's our responsibility as hearers of that word to prove it before we know that it is from the Lord and take their word for it. We should never take the word of someone who presents something in the name of the Lord that contradicts what the Lord has already said. So, I hope that you will believe me a liar before believing anything I say over what the Scriptures say. The Scriptures are the truth, and when you find something there that contradicts anything that I or any other man says, you should believe the Scriptures, and I hope that you will. And I also hope that if you find that I've said something that contradicts what you find in the Scriptures, that you'll come to me and let me know what that thing is so that we may search together for the truth of the matter. We will be in 1 Kings chapter 5 today. I hope that you will be able to find something there that is an encouragement to you and that you will benefit from it. 1 Kings chapter 5 from the English Standard Version. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servant to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram always loved David. And Solomon sent word to Hiram, "You know that David my father could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet." Verse 4. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. And so I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord said to David my father, "Your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, shall build the house for my name. Now therefore command that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me, and my servants will join your servants, and I will pay you for your servants such wages as you set. For you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians." Verse 7. As soon as Hiram heard the words of Solomon, he rejoiced greatly and said, "Blessed be the Lord this day, who has given to David a wise son to be over this great people." And Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, "I have heard the message that you have sent to me. I am ready to do all you desire in the matter of cedar and cypress timber." Verse 9. My servants shall bring it down to the sea from Lebanon, and I will make it into rafts to go by sea to the place you direct, and I will have them broken up there, and you shall receive it, and you shall meet my wishes by providing food for my household. So Hiram supplied Solomon with all the timber of cedar and cypress that he desired, while Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, and 20,000 cores of beaten oil. Solomon gave this to Hiram year by year. And the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he promised him. And there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. Verse 13. King Solomon drafted forced labor out of all Israel, and the draft numbered 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the draft. Solomon also had 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hill country, besides Solomon's 1,300 chief officers who were over the work, who had charge of the people who carried on the work. At the king's command, they quarried out great, costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the men of Gebal did the cutting and prepared the timber and the stone to build the house. Okay, so last time we studied out of chapter 4 the makeup of Solomon's administration. In the beginning of chapter 4, we see that Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were his high officials. Azariah, the son of Zadok, was the priest. Elihoreph and Ahijah, the sons of Shisha, were secretaries. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was in command of the army. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. Azariah, the son of Nathan, was over the officers. Zabud, the son of Nathan, was priest and the king's friend. Ahishar was in charge of the palace, and Adoniram, the son of Abda, was in charge of the forced labor. And I went into some description about the forced labor, and I was wrong, by the way. I wasn't completely right there. So there is no record of prisoners being used as forced labor, and I regret making that comment. For some reason, I thought that there had been one, but I've looked back over the passages involved there, and I don't see that. But indeed, the forced labor was made up primarily of people in the land that lived there outside of the Lord's will. So people who survived the invasion of the Israelites into the promised land, those peoples now became pressed into service as forced labor for Solomon's construction of the temple. And that's not all. There were other people that were used on that force, but none of them were forced labor like these men were. These men were held as slaves to do this work. There were no Israelites used as slaves to do this work, which is described in detail in other passages that we will read later. But I just want to make sure that's clear. This was not a force of prisoners used in this regard. At least it's not recorded anywhere that I've been able to find that was the case. But they were drafted. They were not taken at their own will. They were used against necessarily their own will. Now, we don't really know to what extent it was against their own will. They were taken care of, and it sounds like, from what we're going to read today in chapter 5, that they were treated quite well in this activity that they were engaged in. Continuing in verse 7, Solomon had 12 officers over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each man had to make provision for 1 month in the year, and these were their names. And he gives the names of 12 different men who had charge over different regions, largely the tribes of Israel, and they made provision for the household of Solomon for each month of the year that they were responsible. So likewise, we'll see in other passages that Solomon also made provision now for Hiram out of chapter 5, but we'll get to that shortly. So this was how Solomon's household and administration was taken care of. So anyone who worked for Solomon in the administration was taken care of out of these materials. And the materials were quite significant, and it gives a description over how much that material was. Continuing in verse 22, but we're going to back up just a bit here. In verse 20, Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So Solomon's kingdoms were to the extent of the borders of the promised land. So he had all the land that had ever been promised to Israel, and perhaps even more under his control here. And that's a pretty impressive thing. All those peoples weren't necessarily directly under his charge. They all lived under their own kings, but they all paid tribute to Solomon and his kingdom. So it wasn't exactly the way it should have been, but it was pretty close. And that's an impressive thing, again, to have said about him. Everyone was happy. Everyone had what was necessary for them to be happy, and they were, as a result, happy. They ate and drank and were happy. That's a great thing to have said about the people that you're in charge of. Now, continuing in verse 22, the provisions for one day for Solomon's administration: 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal. This was apparently quite a bit, which is consistent with the rest of these numbers. 10 fat oxen and 20 pasture-fed cattle. That's daily. 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowls. So they had a provision of meats that were very broad and a considerable quantity too. That's a lot of meat, but there were a lot of people involved here. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tipsha to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates. And he had peace on all sides around him. And Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. So Solomon had this wonderful time of peace. It describes here this force of a military force. Basically, Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots. That's 40,000 horses, I believe, the way they're describing it here. And these were trained horses that were capable of pulling a chariot, and 12,000 horsemen. And those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon. So these men not only were protection, the way I'm reading it is that they were part of the military. They not only provide protection and patrols for the areas of Israel, but they also carried the provisions around to make sure that the provisions were distributed correctly. Continuing here, it says, and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. So I believe that was how they secured their provisions, but it also provided protected travel and transportation for commercial goods. So this is a good thing for commerce, as well as the provisioning of the king and his administration. They let nothing be lacking. Barley also and straw for the horses and swift steeds they brought to the place where it was required, each according to his duty. So I believe this is a very important passage here describing how the Lord achieved these things, these good things for Solomon's kingdom and his administration. This was done through this organization and distribution network of these officers and horses and the material goods that had to be distributed for the king's use. Continuing in verse 29, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. And it describes here some wise men who must have been known at the time. And of course, we don't know who these men were. We do know who Solomon was, and that's telling. And he also spoke 3,000 proverbs in verse 32, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. And the people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So I want to say this because I don't think I brought this out last time. Now, they're talking about things that he both witnessed and did not witness. So he spoke of things that he had no reason to know other than the Lord had revealed it to him. And I think that's kind of what they're referring to here about the description of beasts, birds, reptiles, and fish, and possibly also of the kinds of trees that he talks about, because he seemed to be well instructed in the nature of the cedars from Lebanon and this hyssop tree that grew out of the wall. So I think this is talking about an inspired knowledge. It's not what we would think of in terms of someone who might have witnessed these things and learned these from firsthand experience, but somehow Solomon knew something that would be firsthand knowledge without having had firsthand knowledge. I think this is the kind of thing we're reading about here. This is my opinion about this passage, and certainly not supported explicitly in anything that's stated here. Continuing into chapter 5, now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servant to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram always loved David. So Hiram heard that Solomon had taken over the kingdom, and he sent a word to Solomon because of this. He wanted to make sure Solomon knew that he would honor him as king, I would suppose. And this was self-serving, I suppose, to some extent, but I think the point here was that he was truly someone who admired and loved David, and he wanted to be close to Solomon because of that, not exclusively that he was trying to take advantage of a relationship that he'd already had. But it turns out Solomon sent word back to Hiram, "You know that David my father could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet." So he's being kind to his father in this regard. I think he was well aware of the circumstances of his own conception and birth. But here he's being kind to his father and realizing, I think, that making statements to that effect were not necessarily good. But it was still true that David had shed much blood in warfare, and the Lord, as recounted by David, said this as much to David, that he was a man of blood, so he would not be able to build this house of the Lord, this house for the Lord. Continuing in verse 4, "But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side." So Solomon recognized the great blessing that the Lord had shown him. "There is neither adversary nor misfortune," at the end of verse 4. "And so I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord said to David my father, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, shall build the house for my name." Continuing in verse 6, it's back to Solomon making the statement. "Now therefore command that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me, and my servants will join your servants, and I will pay you for your servants such wages as you set, for you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians." So Solomon pays the king a compliment, and compliments the people of Sidon, Tyre and Sidon, for their great skill in handling the woods of the cedars of Lebanon. So this is a great thing, and I wish we knew more about those things today than we do. There's not much left of that time that tells us the nature of those wondrous trees. In verse 7, "As soon as Hiram heard these words of Solomon, he rejoiced greatly and said, Blessed be the Lord this day, who has given to David a wise son to be over this great people." Now this was not something he sent back to Solomon, apparently. It's just something that's recorded here that he said. So the how this was known to the writer, I don't know exactly. It's not clear. But it does continue, "And Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have heard the message that you have sent to me. I am ready to do all you desire in the matter of cedar and cypress timber. My servants shall bring it down to the sea from Lebanon, and I will make it into rafts to go by sea to the place you direct." So the idea here is that they would cut the timbers and take them directly to the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, where they would build rafts out of the wood and put the wood on those rafts and float it down the coast to a place where Solomon would specify. The details, more details, are actually in the Chronicles, and we'll read about those in an upcoming lesson that will catch us up on the Chronicles. "And I will have them broken up the rafts, and you shall receive it. And you shall meet my wishes by providing food for my household." So Hiram supplied Solomon with all the timber of cedar and cypress that he desired, in verse 10, while Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household and 20,000 cores of beaten oil. So Solomon had provision for 1 day of 30 cores of fine flour, we saw in chapter 4, verse 22. So Solomon's provision of flour was that, 30 cores. 30 cores times 30 days, which would be a month, would be 900 cores of fine flour a month, were consumed by Solomon's administration. So the annual consumption of Solomon's house, or Solomon's administration, was 10,800, if we do those maths loosely in our head. So Solomon's household was taking almost half of that in fine flour. How wheat would be compared to fine flour is, I don't know that answer, but it's interesting here that Hiram had this much more wheat than Solomon had flour for his administration on an annual basis. So that's worthy of some consideration. And again, the numbers there are different in Chronicles slightly. There's more material described in Chronicles than there are here in 1 Kings. And the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. Continuing in verse 13, King Solomon drafted forced labor out of all Israel, and the draft numbered 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. So that's what I was talking about. That's a pretty good gig where you work at a destination for a month and then you got 2 months off back home. Now, you're still working when you're home, but you're not away from your family. You're not doing the kind of labor that you would have done the month that you were in at the workplace. So that's not the worst deal in the world, especially since they were forced into the deal. Adoniram was in charge of the draft, which we read about in chapter 4. Solomon also had 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country. Now, we don't know who these people were, but these were apparently not the forced labor necessarily that had gone to work with the King Hiram and his laborers in Lebanon. Besides Solomon's 3,300 chief officers who were over the work, who had charge of the people who carried on the work. Now, again, having briefly read the material out of Chronicles, these men were described there, I believe, as Israelites, but here it would indicate, and another place it would indicate, that these men were of the forced labor force. So there were a certain number of the forced labor who were set over. And it could have been both. There could have been a number of chief officers among the forced labor, and there could have been Israelites who were placed in charge of them. So there's no conflict there necessarily. So we just point out that there is a disparity in the way it's recounted. At the king's command, they quarried out great, costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the men of Gebel did the cutting and prepared the timber and the stone to build the house. And this is not the end of this. We're going to hear more about these details even in 1 Kings. But this is the beginning. They're describing the beginning of the construction of the temple. And this would carry on for, I believe, 7 years. And then we'll see that Solomon continues constructing his own house after that for another 13 years. And again, those numbers come from other passages. But that's interesting to me. This was all covered in chapter 3. At the very first verse, it said Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. That one little verse covers at least 20 years, and then they jump back to describing details. And that's the way these passages go. We have to kind of consider that sometimes we're reading an abbreviation of a large period of time, and sometimes we're reading minute details that we very likely don't even care about and have no significance to us as people who are reading this out of time. This doesn't have a lot of meaning to us in some regards because we don't know some of the things that they're talking about. People closer to the time that this was written would have known things about this passage that we don't understand. They would have taken things for granted and understood things read out of here to be way more significant than they may seem to us in our reading because we don't understand the nature of, for instance, the relationship between the Israelites and the forced labor force was probably not the same as, for instance, the relationship between the Egyptians and the Israelites as laborers and slaves in Egypt before the Exodus. So these are not necessarily comparable things. Even though the language may sound similar to us, we probably don't understand the differences from this reading. Having said that, it's interesting to see the cooperation that Solomon had with King Hiram. And of course, the Lord frowned on foreign treaties, but this was treated as if it wasn't that big a deal. And in other passages, we find out that King Hiram had people in his own charge who were, partly Israelite. They had intermixed people in their charge, and some of these people were sent back to Solomon to be part of his workforce and worked on the temple and the construction of the temple. And that's all kind of interesting given the nature of the commands that the Lord had given Israel in regards to foreigners and how they were not to be partners with foreigners. But this was not treated as a violation of the law, which is interesting. It doesn't seem to be counted here as something that Solomon did incorrectly. Now, Solomon did do some things incorrectly. I would add this. I've been reading out of Luke in my personal reading, and it's interesting to see there that the genealogy recounted by Luke goes through Nathan, the son of David, rather than Solomon, while the genealogy out of Matthew goes through Solomon. Of course, we count this to be an accounting of the way that the Greeks looked at genealogies as opposed to the way the Jews looked to genealogy. One was through the father and the other was through the maternal line. And I believe Luke's is the one that's through the maternal line. I don't believe me on that, but I'm just off the top of my head, I think that's what it is. But it is interesting that this is a disparity, and here we have Solomon's rule that will end in unfavorable conditions with the Lord. All through this time, he's apparently faithful to the Lord. He has not done anything to upset the Lord, but we'll see that comes to an end very abruptly and in a bad way. And this results in the division of the kingdom under Rehoboam and Jeroboam that we will again study when the time comes. I hope you found a word of encouragement in today's lesson. It's all very interesting to me. I know some of this may be dry to other folks, and that's okay. And not everything's of absolute interest to everybody. But here we have this execution begin of the construction of the temple, which was a great and wondrous thing. And it is quite different from the way that I remember even the last time studying this. There are some significant differences the way it's described, and we'll read that going forward in some of the other chapters, Lord willing. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless. Have a great week.
Praise the Lord, praise the Lord. I will call upon the Lord. I will call upon the Lord. Who is worthy to be praised? Who is worthy to be praised? So shall I be saved from my enemies. Saved from my enemies. The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. Jesus Christ, He died for me. Jesus Christ, He died for me. And He took away my sins. I will live with Him for eternity.
I know the Lord liveth,
and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted.
I know the Lord liveth,
and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted.
I know